In these problems, we're trying to evaluate powers of I. They're asking us to simplify this I to the 60th power. What could that be when you multiply I by itself 60 times? How are you expected to do that? Well, let me show you a shortcut for this. Let's just do the first several powers of I. I to the first power is the square root of -1. I to the second power would be the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. And something times itself is squared, the square root of something squared, that's just going to evaluate to -1. So I squared is -1. That's going to be a very handy thing to know. Let's try I to the third. I to the third is 3 square roots of -1. Now, we just learned that when you put two of them together, you get -1. One of them is I, so we would call this -1 times I, or just -I, if we wanted to be as simple as possible about it. And let's go another one, I to the fourth. Well, that's going to be square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. And each of these two we learned is -1, so that's -1 times -1, and oh, well, that's just 1. So I to the fourth power is 1. And then if I go I to the fifth power, well, it's all of that times 1 more, so it's 1 times square root of -1. Well, that's just going to be plain old I again. And if you go I to the sixth power, you end up with -1. The whole series just repeats itself. So it's a 4-step series. You have I, -1, -I, and +1. And that just keeps repeating itself and repeating itself. So to find out what I to the 60th is, instead of multiplying the square root of -1 together 60 times, what I'm going to ask myself is this a multiple of 4? Or if not, how far away is it from a multiple of 4? And figure out where it fits on here. Any multiples of 4 are going to be 1, because this is I to the first power, I to the second power, I to the third power, I to the fourth power. And let's see, yeah, this is a multiple of 4, because 15 times 4 is 60. So that's just going to equal 1. Any multiple of 4, I to that power is going to be 1. Now, if this was 59, I would have said, okay, 60 is a multiple of 4, but I want to go 1 down. I'd end up at -I. If this was 61, I'd say, well, 60 is a multiple of 4, but I got to go 1 up. I'd start over at the top with I. So I to the 61 would be I. All right. Let's try the next one. We've got I to the 79th power. Now, this is a case where I to the 80th, that would be a multiple of 4, so that would equal 1, right? But we want to go 1 back from that, so we choose I to the, -I. So I to the 79th is -I. Now it gets a little trickier with this one. We've got I to the -26, and you need to remember what that negative sign means in a power. When you have a negative power, what it really means is 1 over that quantity to that power positive. So I to the -26 is really 1 over I to the 26th. Now let's figure out what I to the 26th is. So let's see, 24 is a multiple of 4, and 6 would be 2 beyond that. So if I go to the 4 and then go 1, 2 beyond that, I get a -1. So I put that down here. Well, now I've got 1 divided by -1. Well, that's just -1. So I to the -26 is -1. So that's how to find those powers of I. My name is Larry. I'm a teacher at EdVisions Off Campus. It's an online project-based school in Minnesota. If you're interested, you can check us out on the web at lovethisSchool.org. Thanks.